Welcome to a discussion of the Weltempfang of the Frankfurt Book Fair and the Foreign Office. The Weltempfang, which completely takes place digitally this year, has a highly exciting and urgent subject matter in the Corona times, namely Europe connecting cultures. I'm Markus. I'm a TV moderator and journalist at Dreisat and the SWR broadcasting stations, and we'll have a thrilling hour from now. The Corona pandemic has shown very clearly that the reflexes in times of a crisis are the same in all states. Everyone is sealing off, trying to resolve the crisis in their own ways. Very gradually, in some parts, a more level-headed attitude became apparent by means of exchange of knowledge and collective action in solidarity. People have tried to show good crisis management, but practice shows that's a long distance. It's far. So the question we want to discuss now is highly topical. Where does domestic policy end and where does foreign policy begin? And should the two sides of one coin not be amalgamated more strongly beyond the states? How can domestic and foreign policies cooperate very well? And the decisive role can be played by the third pillar of German foreign policy, the AKWP, the Foreign, Culture and Education Policy. Among other ones, Professor Dr. Sigrid Weigel demands this in her study, Transnational Foreign Cultural Policy Beyond the Nation-State Culture, which she does in the scope of the respective research program. The literature scientist is a former director of the Center for Literature and Culture Research, and in her study, she also says that there's a credibility problem, making proposals how to appreciate this institution to anchor it more down. She joins us from northern Italy. Most welcome. From Berlin, Dr. Andreas Görgen, head of the Department Cultural Communication in the Foreign Office. Most welcome too.
Thank you. Welcome.
Dr. Görgen, at the beginning, for all those involved in foreign culture and education policy, people who are not that familiar with it, we know the work of the Goethe Institute and the IFA, all these mediation organizations. The Goethe Institutes have done active cultural policy abroad for decades, going far beyond the language courses and the invitation of German artists. They're important meeting points for culture creators in the respective countries, open spaces which are otherwise not available there. But what makes foreign culture and education policy of the Federal Republic?
Well, first of all, a word about the Goethe Institutes. I think it's a very good example for the fact how foreign cultural policy works of the Federal Republic of Germany. Germany is the only country which gives its cultural institutes to an independent association to carry out the task on its behalf. That started in 1961. Then the federal government of Germany decided that they don't have their own cultural institutes with our flag and the federal eagle. They rather conferred that task to the Goethe Institute. And the Goethe Institute, on our behalf, carries out foreign cultural policy according to its own principles in the freedom of associations articles. And it's good that they don't see that much of us, but rather of the Goethe Institute, because it's the important intermediate organization. And your second example, just to explain that. The IFA is sponsored and funded by us and also by the federal state of Baden-Württemberg and the city of Stuttgart. And we define a research program per study. 20,000 euros are earmarked, and then scientists are asked to do projects. And this is also an instrument to be criticized by our own institutions and to become better. In addition to our cultural work, there is a second important pillar: schools. The foreign German schools and school education abroad. It's about 150 German schools abroad, but also in particular 2,000 partner schools. And this is a reform that I could trigger 10 years ago with the then foreign minister. We said we don't want German schools only in other countries. We would like to improve the education and help to have transnational education abroad in their educational system. And the third pillar are scientific cooperations. Many students know that. The DAAD, if they want to go abroad, and there are funds of the Foreign Office for that. With the scientists, it's then via the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And in addition to that, in the past 4 years, I built up an area that deals with strategic communication. Here it's about social media listening and also disinformation campaigns to be overcome. In a nutshell, the digital space in its manifold forms.
Professor Weigel, all that sounds really great and reasonable, but you say nevertheless the German foreign cultural policy has a problem of credibility. In the media, your study has been accepted on a very positive note, and everyone jumped at it. And they said, a bad certificate for the AKWP, first clear the place at home to do a good job. Is that the central message of your study?
No, of course not. It was not my task to carry out an evaluation of today's practice. And I really appreciate the work of the Goethe Institutes. They do an excellent job. It was rather to develop perspectives which could take up the nation-state's orientation and help globalization. And for that, historic, conceptual, and political preconditions are to be debated, and proposals are developed as a result. It was about a perspective of the future, and the problem of credibility of foreign cultural policy is not to be criticized because of the German foreign cultural policy. It's really true that the convincing power of many that represent foreign cultural policy, they make it international. It's promotion of democracy, equal rights, sustainable business and economy. And this really means that we are measured by credibility. And credibility is measured against the practical activities of German policy and the practice lived in Germany as such. And for that reason, there is indeed a dilemma, which is somehow in the background. It's truly a dilemma. You know, the foreign cultural policy, since expectations have risen enormously, has been facing problems. Earlier, foreign cultural policy was just there to give an image of Germany in the world through the Goethe Institutes, language, literature, arts, and so on and so forth. But for decades now, there have been high hopes and expectations with respect to foreign cultural policy. And it says the foundation of foreign cultural policy of Germany is human rights. And that means that there is a strong commitment of foreign cultural policy to intervene in crisis situations, to bring about sustainable economies, etc. And with this extension of tasks, there is now this dilemma that I referred to. There is a discrepancy between competition interests internationally of German industry on the one hand, which lead permanently to human rights violations. And then there are these very high ethical expectations.
Dr. Görgen, you also see this dilemma?
Well, first of all, I'm really happy that we have this study of Professor Weigel in the first place. In summer 2014, I returned to the Foreign Office. Before that, 5 years, I worked in industry, and later on we can talk about the question whether industry and industrial action would always lead to conflict situations as you described them. And under the then Foreign Minister, Mr. Steinmeier, we started the review process with some proposals for reforms. And one proposal in the autumn of 2017, I mentioned that in a my speech is the post-nation state cultural policy, a cultural policy that should help us to grow out of this nation state anchoring of our institutions. And therefore, we were extremely happy that IFA asked Professor Weigel for our study program, who really has emphasized on this transnational agenda more clearly. The problem of credibility, I think, is a problem which you always have in a political sphere. You need democratic legitimization for your behavior, and that means consideration of the area where democratic formation of will is accredited. And as a foreign cultural policy, you have to do that, and you have to contact other states. This is a dilemma of any foreign policy. Since Kant, we know that there are three preconditions for a dialogue. Have your own principles, accept that there might be other principles, and don't contradict yourself. And here, any criticism is helpful that tells us, okay, here we could have some self-contradiction. And whether that's the case, you have to consider in political terms, that is domestic policy and foreign policy.
Professor Weigel, in your study, you assume a very critical position and do a quick analysis of German and European foreign policy. Is not more than critical? That was my impression, because German conditions are better normally than in other states of the world.
Well, I talked about credibility of goals with respect to human rights. Just have a look at the list. And the human rights organization always complain about it. There is a regular monitoring. And if you have a look at this monitoring, Germany is not really in a very positive light. But let us look at more concrete examples. The dispute has been about the supply chain law for years. I think this is a concrete example for the fact that this dilemma is there. You see, the Minister of Development Cooperation for years has tried to realize the supply chain law. It's part of the coalition agreement, and it has enormous impact on culture in the locations, in the countries. And on the other hand, the economic minister stops it, has stopped it for many years. So you can see how the dilemma shows in concrete terms. My main proposal, or rather demand in my study, is if we are facing problems of globalization, you can't solve that with a departmental policy any longer. And as there are more expectations to foreign cultural policy, we have to respond with a revaluation of the political significance of foreign cultural policy. And this means that we have to improve the significance of foreign cultural policy in other departments. And these higher expectations can not only exist in cooperation of cultural ministers, but it should be a cooperation with many other departments and ministries, and in particular the one that is responsible for international economic and trade policy. Violations of human rights happen mainly in industry, are caused by the economy. And we must not be blind to the effects that are there and that German economy has produced in other countries. Like clean air. In order to have cleaner air in Germany, we destroy forests in South America. And on the other hand, the Foreign Office, with its cultural department, promotes programs that deal with the cultural identity, cultural heritage to be promoted in other countries. But then, here and now, we destroy cultures. So, if foreign cultural policy not only wants to be the good conscience and wants to offer compensation for other problems and shortcomings that are produced by Germany, then they need to have a voice, a very strong and loud voice in the other departments and ministries.
Whereby we could discuss at length whether, for example, a business is in charge of most of the human rights violations. Dr. Görgen, maybe you want to comment on that.
Mrs. Weigel wanted to say something on that.
Well, if we talk about that now, where the human rights violations are located and how intensive they are from the side of the Federal Republic of Germany, it's a discussion of its own.
I don't know whether I've understood it properly, but I don't see it in the way that the three of us have the opinion that most human rights violations are started by the economy, by the industry. I haven't understood it that way, and I don't believe it either. You know, the federal government in the coalition agreement anchored the National Action Plan Human Rights, and since 2018 we have had monitoring for that, and the German economy participates in that, and I don't believe that German economy really is based on human rights in their success. I would contradict to that, and Mrs. Weigel didn't say it that way. I mean, we should not accentuate that too much. I think we should sharpen our view on the role of cultural policy rather, and Professor Weigel is absolutely right. We need more cooperation between the different departments and ministries. And I think we have made good progress with that. There is one project, for example, with the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation. We work together, and the Cultural Ministry. It's about the strengthening of museums by developing a museum agency in creative industry. We have very close cooperation with the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation because they are responsible for vocational training and can go into other sectors from the Goethe Institute. So in many countries where the Goethe Institute is not represented, the Society of International Cooperation becomes active, which is somehow part of the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation. So these are always very small political or administration steps of progress. And in terms of concepts, they are always behind one big concept that is well balanced. And here, the reality in administration and policy is maybe not satisfying for those who observe it, but nevertheless, it's good to see this progress. I would like to deepen it a bit.
Do you sense the increased pressure on foreign cultural policy? And do you realize, on the other hand, that you are heard more than before? Or would you say, well, there's more pressure on the one hand, but the other ones are only interested in it to a minor extent?
Let us move away from the classical sectors. We all know them, and there a lot of know-how has been collected in our societies. And if we move away from that, maybe we see that in the past 5 years, we have changed cultural policy to become a true society policy. In 2015, we started with a program which is called Promotion of Civil Societies in countries of the Eastern Partners. It's Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. It's about the Caucasus states. And here, the headline is not cultural cooperation any longer. It says Promotion of Civil Society Cooperation. And lately, I think in the recent crisis in Belarus, the effects were enormous because all of a sudden we have 50 project partners with whom we have worked together in the past 4 years, and they gave us a totally different picture of the situation in Belarus than what we see presented by the official channels. And it has been massively supported. We started with 5 million, and members of the German parliament increased that fund. They always carried out some monitoring, and at the end it was 20 million. Just as one example, just to illustrate that change is happening indeed towards an international social policy. But there is criticism also which promotes it, and I'm grateful for this criticism that has been formulated by Professor Weigel, because I can tell my colleagues at home we need to go on in that way.
Professor Weigel, you say it's a struggle against windmills. On the one hand, increasing expectations. On the other hand, not the interconnection, not being heard in all fields of politics.
Well, I said, if cooperation does not include parts of the economy, we run the risk that there will be a fight against windmills. This support of civil social movements abroad, I mean, this is a trend of foreign cultural policy that I absolutely support. But if we link it with domestic policy, the civil society in Germany has to support it as well. That should be the case. But it is supported. These are civil society organizations in the Federal Republic of Germany that have their partner organizations in these eastern countries. With that, we strengthen the civil society activities in Germany. It's a police trade union in South Germany working together with a police trade union behind the euro. It's another project in other areas, but it could also be a school partnership, a school twinning, where we replace windows in schools 3 times that were under military attack in eastern Ukraine. Yeah, it's a very practical approach. Yes, precisely. That's what it's all about. Okay, it always works out if it's about democracy, promotion, equal rights, and similar things. But problems are more subtle than that. Let me give you one example to clarify that. An example that has just been published. It's a very good example for cooperation. The Mercator Foundation Scholarships for Journalists supported a research paper on the excavation, on illegal excavation of the Sanuk countries in Nigeria. And what they found is a very complicated, subtle network of archaeology as a science, illegal excavation, and groups of cartography in those countries. And I mean, it's not so easy to be in line with goals of human rights and democracy promotion, because always you have to accept the existing power situation in order to reach anything, to do something. And many NGOs are complaining that relief goods can only go via the corrupt governments in these states. Partly this is the case. So that's what we need, and that's the plea of revaluation of of foreign cultural policy. We absolutely need the expertise of people who work in these countries, and we need them here also in Germany to give us advice what to do. And that's what I mean, higher voices, louder voices for the foreign cultural policy. And that's why I criticize concepts like soft power or competition of narratives, because this is single dimensional. And the people we talk to are regarded recipients, but we need to create a dialogue. And the know-how, the knowledge in foreign cultural policy needs to be used more intensively for integration policy, migration policy, refugee policy, etc. And the only controversy, I think, Mr. Görgen, that we have is that always when it's about the economy and trade policy, then cooperation becomes a problem. I think the Africa policy is the best example for that. When the Chancellor discovered Africa as an important continent after the refugee crisis, and she traveled to African countries again and again, which are absolutely welcome, and for a long time it was overdue. Her trips to the were reported under the political resorts combating causes of migration. And if you moved on and looked into the economic pages, it was also to create better contacts for businesses, German business who wanted to do business there, opening up of sales markets, produce migration causes again.
Dr. Görgen, what is your opinion? It's a matter of development cooperation again, which of course also influences foreign cultural policy.
Well, yes. I don't want to become encroaching in our political discourse here. There you have to ask a fully fledged politician who's elected. I hope you understand that. But let me respond to 2 aspects. One refers to domestic and foreign policy, which seems to be so important for Professor Weigel, and in an immigration society it becomes ever more important. At the moment, there is a cabinet committee that deals with racism, right-wing xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. And I participate a bit there. And of course, racism is also a cultural phenomenon. It's not only a security phenomenon, inverted commas, but it is also a cultural phenomenon. And there are racist structures that form in a society. And definitely, we need to change our relations with Africa. And we do it as a logical consequence as well. We want that, be it Africa or Latin America. Definitely, we will have to acknowledge different ideologies. The anchoring of nature, the rule of nature in Ecuador in its constitution is much more progressed than in the German constitution. And they have a totally different understanding of nature apart from our Cartesian understanding, where we are dominating nature. Then another aspect about Africa, you see that when we deal with colonialism and what I told you before about an immigration society and how to deal with racism, definitely in our relations with Africa, in education, creative industries, etc., we learn a lot. That's enormous. They were faster with their films on their mobile phones than we were. You know, in many formats, they are more innovative than we are, as we sit in these state-subsidized structures and just carry out self-perfection. That's the one point. Then, in an immigration society, more than ever before, we need an understanding for dreams, but also for traumatas, people that come from other countries with their dreams and traumatas. Yeah, this education means that we need to really integrate into a society. We don't have compulsory schooling because we think it's so well with the kids. No, behind compulsory schooling, there is this obligation to integrate into the system. And the society is not the society of the 50s, 60s, last century, or the image you had of it. And therefore, it's absolutely necessary that more strongly than ever before, we acknowledge, we perceive the dreams and traumata people bring to Germany. And then they become Germans. And it is their history. There's also history of our situation. And this is part of our history and part of our future. And the Goethe Institute works strongly with the Georg Eckert School Book Institute, so that together we have a look at school books again, and against the backdrop of the Goethe colleagues abroad, German textbooks are also improved for school classes for refugees, for immigrants. This is really a good example how domestic and foreign policy come together.
Well, that's one of your central points, Professor Weigel. But before we discuss this in further detail, let me come back to the rhetoric appreciation of German foreign policy. You mentioned soft power, cultural diplomacy.
But you don't hear that from me. Never ever you hear soft power mentioned by me.
While the competition of the narratives.
Mrs. Weigel should come in on that. I mean, Germany, it has become popular with the reception of German comments in papers. The term of the narrative is from Leginas. This is in the middle of the European philosophical debate, and he means narration. Narrating the basic values of understanding the other. This is what is meant, and not this instrumental nonsense, which you can sell easily, and sometimes you need that in order to produce headlines, but unfortunately, it doesn't explain a lot. And for me, this has been really useful. 2018, I made a competition analysis, and half of the cultural sector started an outcry saying, you are a bad person. You regard culture a field of competition, but we only carry out cooperation projects. Sorry, I have a different opinion on that. The market is determined by other market participants and their behavior. And I can't say that Russia, with Russia MIA, the Cultural Institute, or China, is only cooperating. No, there is some kind of a competition. Okay, you want to dissolve it at the end, you want to overcome it, but we can develop our own stance, and that's nice.
Professor Weigel, as I got you, For you, competition of the narratives is also an expression of a wrong approach or a wrong understanding of foreign cultural policy.
Well, first of all, it was not about, you know, touching upon your linguistic behavior. No, also using the terms that people use nowadays. And instead of a political revaluation in the past decades, there has been rather a rhetorical revaluation, and not only in Germany. And I was surprised to see that. And I looked at where these concepts came from. And then I found that concepts like soft power and cultural diplomacy come originally from the Cold War. And maybe it's no coincidence that it comes up again, as certain ways we are in a new Cold War that is between the United States and China. I believe that the notion soft power describes the way how China instrumentalizes cultural and sciences, offers scholarship programs in Africa. There has been a recent study on the way how the Chinese leadership tries to use science for its political goals in a very successful way. Soft power policy, so to speak, with cultural promotion programs, funding the museum for the Museum of Black Civilization in Dakar. This is successful soft power, and I don't believe that we should go to the same level. With the competition of narratives, you can quarrel about that, but as a matter of fact, the critical analysis of narratives comes from historical research by Hayden White, and one wanted to show that the narratives are playing an important role in structuring the history and historiography. And foreign cultural policy has to uncover the borderline between narrative and propaganda. It's a floating line. We have to show more commitment, acting against all the fake news and narratives that are offensively used by China, also during pandemic times, more and more. And we have to make sure that European culture and modernity are not demounted by them. Of course, we have to resist that. I don't think it can be done with a narrative. It works better with acting as a model example, a role model of a functioning democracy, where we try to create more social justice and a better way to create better working and living conditions. The pandemic has uncovered a lot of things, also in our country. You don't need to see the pandemic only. You only have to go to South Europe to see the bad working condition of refugees and agricultural policy. By the way, that's subsidized by the European Union. Live democracy. This seems to be more effective than such rhetorical forms and formula. We don't need them. We don't need them for our foreign cultural policy, because the German foreign cultural policy is much better than suggested by the
Görgen,
concepts.
another remark on that by you.
I think it's highly interesting what Mr. Weigel says, and I learn a lot. I would like to come back to two elements. The first element is, it would have been a good idea to have invested so much money into China, Chinese scholars, as United States did it, and more in cultural exchange with China than we have done. If we had done that, then maybe we had made a larger contribution to prevent what we are seeing at the moment. That's a perfectioning of an instrumental American approach, sorry for that, by an authoritarian regime. Right? Yeah. I think that should make us reflect on that. Just to put it bluntly, in China, the Federal Republic of Germany spends about 25 million euros for cultural cooperation and educational cooperation. This is the budget of the Foreign Office. This is more or less the same amount that we give to UNESCO and spend in the United States. And then you might ask, is that enough? And you said it. In order to offer our model of society as a model of cooperation. But this requires two things. First, I have an offer, I can formulate it, and that brings me back to the narratives. And secondly, we have to pay for it. for selling it, so that I'm willing to ship it, put it into a plane, or put it into the internet and say, come with me, work with me. And for that, we need further investment. A second point that I would like to briefly touch upon, the soft power concept. Joseph Nye and everything behind, Mrs. Weigel said it's from the Cold War. But the idea is always, with power, you can implement your interests. And that's the same, like people understand communication. It's a message that goes via channel to a recipient. And if the recipient doesn't listen, you have to improve the channel or beat the recipient or put more volume into the voice, as if that was easy. What we should not forget, we come from a society where there are two spaces of freedom that are more protected than any other. That's the freedom of arts and science. And I only talk about arts and science, not culture, arts. Yeah. So we protect space where there might be a contradiction with society and can freely develop. And there we can be much more self-confident when offering it. You don't find that much in so many other societies, that the freedom of arts and science plays such an important role, also to give room for contradictions. And democracy in our country is based on contradiction. Democracy is only possible with contradiction, and therefore you need freedom. You need space like that, where there can be contradiction. And I think this is a unique offer. It has nothing to do with soft power.
Professor Weigel.
No, it's not only an offer. I would say it's a practice, which is very much at stake at the moment because of global digitization and also because of soft power policy of China jeopardizes it. Yeah, the Chinese government has understood that science also from Europe can be bought. It's corruptible, and that's really a big problem. We have concrete examples for that, how cooperations of universities with China are not only used for espionage, but also to exert influence. It's not only to represent our goals. No, we also have to defend Europe, of course. European history, European culture is to be defended. And here, I think I am talking about politics, not of you, Mr. Görgen, but there are people that are too naive, I would say, especially with respect to China. And therefore, the investment in Africa at the moment are the ones that are most important from your ministry. I would like to move out from this attitude of defense or threatening. It has become really fashionable in Germany. You know, if you read and if you listen, you hear we feel threatened so much. Not what you said, Mrs. Weigel. It's not the two of us that I refer to. You feel threatened by what comes from Russia, China, Turkey. Okay, there is some truth in it. But on the other hand, we can be more self-confident and claim, first, what we have here is quite good. And we also think that we are capable of showing that to other societies so that they can orient to what is good in our society. Just to give you one other example for our discussion. In 2016-17, we started with a program that was called Scholar at Risk, and then the one Artist at Risk was started. When in the 30s, Germany had to leave Germany, other countries accepted them and offered shelter. Switzerland, in the United States, there were programs to protect artists and scholars. Germany didn't have a similar program. Therefore, we had the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation to do that. So artists and scholars who are threatened so much in their freedom that they rather come to Germany facing a highly complex tiring scientific program, these people are supported. And the same we do with artists. And we started a program for people who defended human rights. So this is what I mean, offering something to people, opening up for those people who want to work in a society like ours and thus be a bearer of hope for their own societies, that they can develop in this direction.
That is one facet. But if I listen to that, seeing how we commit ourselves in Africa on behalf of Germany, well, then, in terms of an important demand in your study, Professor Weigel, wouldn't we rather need a European foreign cultural policy to have a strong counterweight to what China does in Africa?
Of course, we would need that, but we are so far away from it. It's really a tragedy that in the European Union, the differences have become larger in the past 2 years. There has not been a Europeanization. I think the differences that we have within Europe need to be processed more. And we cannot only come up with demands saying that all countries participate in everything. Let me give you an example for that. It's about the distribution of migrants, of refugees in Europe. This is a big point of dispute, and that has led to further discussions. And if we look at the root causes of migration, then of course we will find colonial history easily. And of course, particularly Western European countries are much more involved in colonial history than Eastern European states that are facing totally different problems at the moment, like nation building, post-Soviet countries that have to do their nation building first. And then we have the problem of nationalism. This processing of European history, including conflicts and crises, is a precondition for a common and shared European foreign policy, which would be extremely helpful, because many countries, different countries, have different connections with different regions, like France. They have connections to the Arab region because of the history, with the Institut du Monde Arabe. I mean, that's an important partner for Germany as well, and Europe. It would be an important component for European cultural policy. And other countries, like Eastern European countries, have different connections, more comprehensive international connections in other regions. This would be a network which would be so helpful. But for that, we have to fulfill the preconditions. You can't be unbiased if you don't process biases. And the processing of biases, they are on the agenda in Europe in order to get to this point. And for that, proposals like European universities and the networking of European schools are really an important precondition, because we can only hope that the next generation would not fall prey to nationalism any longer, would not develop this nationalist reflex that we have seen in the pandemic once again, where there is a lot of national egotism in Europe.
Therefore, the position now is okay, but it's also an empty hope, getting to European cultural policy.
I don't see it that way. I don't know whether a European cultural policy is really something I want. If I mean 27 nation states in Brussels coming together, I don't know whether I want that. I mean, you worked as a moderator with Arte for a long time. You know what films Arte produced in the 80s and 90s. The editor came from Germany, the main actor from Poland. The other actor came from France, and then there was a Spanish cameraman. And I don't give you any film title here. And then it was produced in Cologne ports. This is not European culture that has come about. Mrs. Weigel, you are laughing, and this means you agree with me. I love Cologne ports. You have 127th Baltic choirs and 127th Hungarian literature, and so on and so forth. And in the worst case, German cuisine. What we have tried, and in the public it doesn't sound that sexy, but we came together with the Swedish, the Dutch, the French, and in Turkey we support 3 cultural spaces, yeah? Gaziantep, Diyarbakir, not easy region, and Iskria. And the Treaty of Aachen decided that the Goethe Institutes would go together with the Institut Français. We selected the places, and that's a revolution as this grows out of the nation state way of thinking. Thinking it's about German culture or French culture only. As French and Germans, we have to be Europeans and make that clear. And therefore, there were places that we selected. We helped the Goethe Institute, not only with money, but also with donations, political, administrational support, so that it becomes true that maybe in Rio de Janeiro, you go into an institute which is Franco-German right from the beginning and would be the natural contact point for other Europeans who want to participate. I mean, that shouldn't stay like that. It should grow. You know, it shall grow into a platform so that others can participate. With the universities, then, with the European universities, this idea of Macron, we really have achieved a lot today. In the first round, we had 30, now it's 50 universities who do that. And here, hopefully, for the generation of my children, we have what Professor Weigel described as a hope. And third and last point, Mrs. Weigel is absolutely right. We as Europeans would never, ever should have accepted that the Chinese built a museum in Senegal that Senegal wanted for 30 years. Senghor wanted it for 30 years, and Europe didn't do it. They were not able to do it, to go into such an infrastructure and invest there. And therefore, I came together with the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation, the Cultural Ministry, and all other German museums, because the federal government needs to be in a position to invest into such a cultural infrastructure as a partner and help that culture is a place of freedom and not as a place of propaganda.
Hence, cooperation takes place partially, and yet you say, Professor Weigel, also in this case, we need to consider our past more, especially in Western European countries, dedicating ourselves to colonial history, even in Germany, and also consider this for our NS past. Migration today and our colonial history also need to be integrated more in this narration.
Mr. Görgen showed a satire of European culture somehow, you know, that you should not do it with proportions only. That cannot be it, but we can't have a single or uniform European culture. No one would believe that, and it doesn't exist anyways. And if you have a look at the program of the European Commission at the moment, there is one department which means defending what Europe is, but no one really knows what Europe really is. And I believe that this movement of the European Union, or the idea of Europe, really is linked to this, that there is a gap somehow, you know, between the proclamations of and about Europe and the experience, the stronger experience of community and dissent. I mean, you can't construct unity, as some historians have proposed it, a common European history to be invented. No, you have two phases. You have to see the dreams and traumas that you mentioned, Mr. Görgen, from other cultures. They are also found within Europe. They are virulent here. And for us, I think they are an important subject in order to create historic awareness, memories of our history, and put it in the place of national identities. And if we become immigration countries more and more, then the point is, where is the place for the modes of existence, the culture, and the origins of people? And how can we create a new way of togetherness, equal rights, democratic, and in exchange? You know, that's a task in Europe, just as you have it in the relations of Germany and other countries of Europe and the world on other continents. So just as I regard it necessary to link up domestic and foreign policy, we also have to link up within Europe, and we have to coordinate our work in Europe. I think this is a precondition for cultural action of Europe in the world.
But how to get there?
By
Dr. Görgen.
I listened to Mrs. Weigel first. Well, the school books, the textbooks, that's a good example. There's one museum for European culture in Brussels, but it has rather a representative character, and it would make sense in the different European countries to have museums like that. But it should not give a single unity story, but rather talk about the conflicts, the history of conflicts, the still prevalent conflicts that we have based on our history. Let me mention Volker Knicke, the head of the Buchenwald concentration camp museum. He said awareness of history means historic knowledge, understanding, and judging. And the phenomenon, for example, of conflicts with Poland and Germany, is also very important, an important field which shows the symptoms of conflicts between East and Western Europe. People in Germany, the German population knows a lot about Polish anti-Semitism, but they don't know much about the way Germany behaved in the Second World War in Poland, how they rampaged in Poland, and how they produced victims in Poland. So a lack of awareness creates a lack of awareness of history about conflicts that we are facing today. And that's what I mean when I say processing biases, and not only demand unbiased behavior between European countries.
Dr. Görgen.
That's super. That's super. And therefore, it was good to listen to you first. I learned something again. And what Professor Weigel said, I would say, yes, exactly. We have to create something like a cultural intelligence at all different levels, historic awareness, training, and understanding for the others, and maybe leaving our comfort zone. Sometimes you have the impression that a German society or a European nation-state society feels like a Volvo back in the 80s. You know, you have the armored side panels. That's the social security system. The Volvo is not that expensive, and, you know, richness up and down, not that big. And then you drive through a country in which the infrastructure is wonderful, everything okay, and everyone drives a Volvo. And from that feeling of homogeneity, the security of a Volvo, here we are pushed out because of crisis outside, internal distortions, and maybe we have a look at it in a more positive way. And as a last example for cultural policy, I would say that Foreign Minister Maas asked Wundervoll Eliasson to become the director of the German cultural program within the European Council presidency. Everyone would have expected that during European Council presidency, we would go to Europe and give concerts of Brahms, Beethoven, or readings of Brecht. Leading thinkers of Germany to be shown, telling people we not only know how the Swabian housewife behaves, but we also know what culture does. We intentionally didn't do that. The German cultural program is determined and characterized by a European artist living in Berlin. And secondly, it's meant for children. And thirdly, it takes place in the digital field. We decided it back in 2019. No one knew what COVID would be, and we were lucky, you know. And you don't know it because you are too old and you have not downloaded the app yet. But www.earthspeaker.art, there you find it. There you'll see what children between 10 and 15 do from all over Europe, what they do with objects that speak for them, and you see what they say. It has to do with plastics of boys, for example, but it also has to do with the fact that this creates this shared European publicity and public space, and we have to process that further.
Professor Weigel, very quickly, a question. You said we need to consider historical things, acknowledge historical things, including the differences in Europe. But this common cultural heritage we have in Europe, it's there. You dislike the notion of the German cultural nation, but as Europe, we are one continent of culture with a lot of common history, common development, as Dr. Görgen put it. Well, this is considered to a certain extent. So, what about the common positive narrative? Shouldn't it not also develop of European cultural policy, which we take to the outside world?
What's positive or negative? What does that mean? There is no positive or negative. History, it's sometimes a success story and sometimes a story of wars and conflicts, eradication and expulsion. And it has an ongoing effect. Niklas Luhmann said culture is the memory of a society. And because of digitization, we live in a time in which history is lost more and more, but it still has its effects in the cultural subconsciousness. And we have a common history in Europe, but not a uniform one, not one and the same. And I think there are different ideas in that. You see the distance of ever bigger groups of the population, of established policy and politics, and also the European idea. I think this should really make us waking up so that we think about it and ask what are the root causes for it. And therefore, I regard it necessary to deal with the problems, to address the problems, to spell them out that are to be seen in populism, in its very ideology. These are highly problematic, racist answers to problems that are there to be seen on the roads outside, and we have to address them. And these are also distortions within Europe. Of course, this also includes inner European migration. I need not recall here what working conditions we had with Tönnies, the meat processor in Germany. If you deal with things like that, working conditions in Europe knew that before. I mean, you don't believe that this doesn't create resentments against Germany and promotes them? The way how you see migrant workers, etc., are dealt with. And we didn't talk about one point. Europe, at the moment, somehow, Mr. Görgen, I mean, we have a lot to offer, you are right, but we also have a lot to defend. And Europe, at the moment, is in a highly criticized position from this theoretical corner of post-colonialism, which internationally really shows enormous effect and influence. That is both in Africa and also in other continents and Eastern Europe in particular. I see it with the students. I see it with the young academics. And if the young students and academic people and pupils paint this phantom picture of Europe, the West, showing that every evil comes from Europe, you can't really counteract that with narrations. But you have to process our cultural subconsciousness. That is this feeling of superiority that is deeply there. We have to offensively process colonialism and what Europe did in that world in history. That's the only way to paint a more differentiated picture of Europe in the world. And I am facing that a lot. Like I am an expert for research papers and applications and doctorate theses, etc. We must not underestimate what will come. And this is really a phantom image of Europe where every evil comes from. They say Europe is the reason for every bad thing that happened in the world, colonialism, the environmental disaster, etc. We have to deal with that.
Dr. Görgen, since we have almost reached the end of our talk, a very fundamental subject matter which would also need another hour. Let's talk about that briefly.
1 hour now? No, 1 hour, very brief.
Our hour is almost over. So if you want to talk about this basic question, as mentioned by Professor Weigel, contribute your point of view, please.
Okay. First of all, you get the expected and correct sentence. In the coalition agreement of this coalition, it says that there are 3 approvals of committed injustice that Germany has to deal with and that are part of a democratic consensus. That's dealing with the injustice of the Nazi regime and the SED regime, and the first time it says dealing with our colonial past. So this is politically a big step ahead. And as government, we're always lagging behind. We don't do enough, not quickly enough. That's clear. But we can talk about that in the next hour. All right. Secondly, Professor Weigel talked about the most recent past and the younger generation. At the beginning of our talk, we mentioned the necessity also to look at other cosmologies and mention other dreams and traumas. In COVID, there are 2 big appeals that circulated in Africa. One was signed by Bodo Schuinka for the Anglophone intellectuals, and the other one, Felmi Tsar, Suleima Bashir, Dianye, who lives in New York, and Ashim Bende. And in Europe, I think we have not recognized them, acknowledged them sufficiently. But there are different approaches behind. That is how a society of the future could look like, different from the one we are used to. So we have difficulties in understanding it. We not only need advice of civil society, but also advice of science that has to more intensively deal with the question, what kind of concepts are being developed in Africa, social concept, what's being discussed, and what's the direction that they have taken. So that was the nutshell of 1 hour.
Thanks a lot for your contributions. Thanks to the 2 of you. Thank you for watching and listening. If you have to become curious to get to know the study by Professor Weigel, just like the other studies from the EFAF research program, can be downloaded free of charge under publication.de. I wish you an exciting, thrilling time on and with the Frankfurt Book Fair. Thank you.